A child was in a coma for 26 days, and when she woke up, she revealed something that shocked even the doctors. She said she saw Jesus, and also the devil. In this video, you will discover a real and shocking account of a near-death experience, where heaven and hell are revealed through the pure eyes of a child. What she heard from Jesus is an urgent spiritual wake-up call for us all. Get ready to delve into a testimony that science cannot explain, but that confirms profound biblical truths. If you are looking to understand more about life after death, divine purpose and the mysteries of the soul, this video is for you. It's not just a story, it's a calling from God. If you believe that this type of revelation can transform lives, just as it touched ours, then leave your like right now. This helps us get this message to even more people who need to hear about God's love and about the spiritual dangers that many ignore. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week we bring real testimonies, near-death experiences and revelations that can open your spiritual eyes. You won't want to miss what comes next. Christian was just 7 years old when everything happened. A happy, sensitive boy with a sparkle in his eyes that enchanted everyone around him. He lived with his parents in Lexington, Kentucky, a quiet town in the United States, surrounded by green hills and a welcoming community where everyone knew everyone by name. Her days were filled with simple activities like riding her bike around the neighborhood, drawing crosses and angels in her coloring books, and listening to the Bible stories her mother read before bed. It was an ordinary family with a living faith. Every Sunday they were at church, and Christian loved singing children's praises. His favorite verse was John 3:16, and he proudly repeated it to the adults in the church, as if he were a little pastor in training. But the tranquility of that house was shaken in a brutal and unexpected way. What seemed like just a fever, something every child gets from time to time, quickly turned into something scary. Christian began to have difficulty breathing. In less than 24 hours, he was being rushed to the local hospital. Doctors were worried. The situation was getting worse very quickly. The fever no longer went away with any medicine, and the infection began to spread. After a battery of tests, the diagnosis came: a systemic infection of unknown origin with rapid evolution. In other words, Christian's body was collapsing, and doctors would need to induce a coma to try to control the inflammation that was compromising his organs. The family's shock was indescribable. The parents, Rachel and Thomas, could barely understand what was happening. From one day to the next, the son, who was running around the yard, was now intubated, immobile, attached to tubes and wires, surrounded by machines that did the job of keeping his small body alive. Time seemed to stand still inside the pediatric ICU of that hospital in Lexington. The doctors were sincere from the beginning. They said they would do everything within science's power, but it would be a difficult fight. The survival rate for cases like Christian's was low, and even if he woke up, there was a risk of irreversible brain damage. That's when Rachel clung to the only thing she had left: faith. She began sleeping next to her son's bed with the Bible on her lap and prayed constantly. He prayed in a low voice, out loud. He prayed in silence, with tears rolling down his face. Verses like Psalm 91, Isaiah 41:10, and Jeremiah 30:17 have become daily mantras. She believed with all her heart that God could reverse that situation, and even when the medical reports became increasingly pessimistic, she didn't give up. Thomas, the father, who always had a more rational faith, also surrendered to prayer. On the third day of his coma, he knelt on the cold hospital floor and said a sincere prayer that impressed the medical team present. "Lord, I don't know how to ask you for this, but if there is still a plan for my son here on earth, give him back to us. And if there isn't, give me the strength to understand." They were heavy, painful words, but they came from the soul of a father who had nowhere else to run. News of Christian's condition quickly spread throughout the local community. Churches began to pray. Intercession chains were created. Videos asking for prayers circulated on social media. People from various corners of the United States began to be moved by that boy's story. And it was then that, spontaneously, a spiritual mobilization began to grow. People who didn't even know the family began to intercede in fasts, services, and vigils. And not just Christians, Jews, evangelicals, Catholics, even spiritualist groups joined their forces in a single cry. Meanwhile, the days passed, and Christian remained silent, motionless. Time inside that ICU was like a clock without hands. Rachel counted each day as an eternity, and every morning, when she saw her son's face motionless on the hospital pillow, she said the same words. "Son, Mommy is here. Jesus is with you. Come back to me." On the 15th day, doctors warned that it might be time to prepare the heart. The condition was stable, but without neurological response. And with each passing day, the chance of a full awakening diminished. But in that painful environment, there was something that the professionals couldn't explain. Some nurses reported feeling something different when entering the room. A nursing technician who considered herself skeptical confessed that when touching Christian's hand, she felt a soft, warm electric current. Others said that as they prayed, the mood seemed to change. Rachel remained firm. Even though her eyes were swollen from crying, she never stopped declaring God's promises out loud. She believed in healing. She believed in miracles. And even without understanding the reason for such a difficult test, she trusted. Sometimes I would look up at the hospital ceiling and say, "Lord, if all this has a purpose, reveal it in your time. But don't let my son go." And it was in this environment where faith confronted despair that something began to happen. Small signs, slight movements, changes in monitors. On the 23rd day, Christian's heart beat faster when he heard the praise his mother played on her cell phone. On the 25th, the beats became more stable while reading the Bible. Until on the 26th day, around 6 a.m., one of the monitors issued a soft alert. Christian had moved the finger on his left hand. The nurse in charge approached and noticed that the vital signs were changing. He immediately called the medical team. Within minutes, the room was full. And then it happened. A slight movement of the eyelids, a slow opening of the eyes. The body that had seemed unresponsive for almost a month was beginning to awaken. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief. Rachel fell to her knees, crying loudly, thanking God. Thomas couldn't stop shaking. Christian was coming back, but he still hadn't said anything. He just stared at the ceiling, as if you were between two worlds. As if he carried within him something much greater than a simple medical recovery. Something that he would still tell. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. Because what Christian revealed days after waking up is simply unbelievable. While the doctors were still trying to understand the miracle they had just witnessed, Christian remained silent. His open eyes seemed to be looking at a fixed point on the ceiling, but not like someone waking up confused. It was a deep, intense look, as if he was mentally reviewing a memory that did not belong to this world. Rachel held her son's hand and cried in silence, trying to contain the avalanche of mixed emotions. Relief, astonishment, gratitude. But at the same time, she felt that something different surrounded that awakening. Christian was there, yes, but part of him seemed still far away. That same afternoon, when the silence was finally broken, Christian whispered some words that seemed more like an outburst than articulate speech. His voice was low, weak, but full of meaning. He said, "Mommy, I'm out of here." Rachel immediately bent down beside him, stroking his face, trying to understand what that meant. But Christian closed his eyes again, as if he needed more time. And she, without pressing, just continued there, present, knowing that, at the right time, he would speak. And he spoke. The next day, Christian had his eyes open, looking at the hospital room window. The morning sun invaded the room with a soft, almost golden light. And it was there, with the calm of someone sharing something sacred, that he began to tell. His words were simple but filled with unshakable certainty. I saw myself lying down, but I wasn't here anymore. I was up, floating. I saw everything. He described his own body with disconcerting clarity. He said he saw the tubes, the machines, his mother at the bedside praying, the medical team coming and going. I saw everything, but I didn't feel any pain. It was as if I was light as a feather. Rachel listened to every word with her heart racing, his eyes fixed on his son, trying to absorb everything. With each sentence, a mixture of amazement and reverence filled the room. Christian then said something that made the parents look at each other. There was a light, a very strong light, stronger than the sun, but it didn't hurt your eyes. It was hot, but it was a good warmth, like a hug. He explained that this light seemed to call to him. It was like she knew my name, like she'd known me forever. As he spoke, Christian kept his gaze distant, as if he were still half there. He said he began to be carried away by this light, as if he were gliding through the air. It was like a tunnel, but it wasn't a dark tunnel. It was all light, and the walls seemed to be made of something I don't know the name of, like glow. When trying to explain, he made gestures with his hands, looking for words he didn't yet know to describe what he experienced. It was a vivid account, full of emotion that transcended any childish invention. This was not a story he had heard or imagined. It was a testimony coming from the soul. But amid the beauty of this crossing, something changed. Christian stopped for a moment. The expression on his face changed. His eyes became more attentive, almost scared. He then said something that completely changed the tone of the story. Before I got there, before the light, I felt something different. Rachel held her hand tightly. It was a dark thing, very dark and cold. It didn't touch me, but I felt like it was there, close, looking at me. Thomas asked, "Could you see that thing, son?" And Christian nodded, but took a while to speak. I didn't want to look at her, but I looked, and she looked at me. She had no face, but she had eyes, and her eyes were red like coals. The room was silent. Even the monitors didn't seem to be emitting sound at that moment. Christian then took a deep breath and added, "I was scared, but when I looked at the light again, I felt it was stronger, much stronger." The tension was palpable. It was as if in that hospital room, at that moment, there was an echo of what happened between the visible and the invisible. The contrast between what he called the warm light and the cold thing was beginning to draw the contours of an experience far beyond human comprehension. And even without going into details at that moment, Christian blurted out phrases that shocked his parents. I wasn't alone there, but I had someone with me, someone very good. But when Rachel tried to ask who it was, he just smiled and said, "I'll tell you later." That "after" carried a weight that no one knew how to measure, because something inside Christian had changed. He no longer spoke like an ordinary child. His words were more mature, as if he had come back different, transformed. In the days that followed, the boy regained his physical strength, but his mind seemed to no longer just inhabit this plane. At various times I stared at the sky through the hospital window, in silence. Sometimes he smiled for no reason. Sometimes he cried lightly. Rachel asked if he was okay, and he said, "I remember, and I miss you." These words echoed in the mother's heart. Missing what? From who? Christian was beginning to show a deep attachment to something he experienced there, and that no one here could understand. But even so, he maintained a calm look, full of faith. He wasn't scared. There was no evidence of trauma. On the contrary, he spoke with a serenity that moved even the hospital professionals. Nurses cried as they listened to his reports. Doctors left the room in silence, visibly touched, and that started to generate movement outside of there. Pastors, priests, and religious leaders from the region began to visit Christian. They wanted to hear. They wanted to understand. Above all, they wanted to confirm whether what he said was based on scripture. And with each conversation, something new emerged. Small excerpts that, together, formed a larger narrative. But Christian seemed to be waiting for the right moment to tell everything. "I'm going to speak, but it has to be at the right time, because there are things that need to be heard with the heart." That family's faith, which was already strong, was now on another level. They knew that God had done more than heal their son. They knew there was a greater purpose behind it all, and they were willing to listen, to learn, and to share. Because, as Christian himself said in one of his moments of silence, there are people who think they know what happens after death, but they don't. It was at that moment that Rachel understood that her son had not just come back to life. He had returned with a mission. And that is precisely what begins to reveal itself in the next words he shared. Words that are not just descriptions, they are deep spiritual messages, full of teachings, signs, and an urgency that needs to be heard. But that's what we're going to find out next. What did this story awaken in you? Comment faith, and if you have experienced something that logic cannot explain, share it too. Your experience can touch other hearts. The room was still the same, the white walls, the sound of the rhythmic heart monitor, the gentle breeze coming through the window, and the whispered prayers for the parents didn't stop. But inside Christian, something was being processed, as if his soul was still organizing the fragments of something that surpassed everything he had known until then. It was as if he had returned from the unknown, carrying baggage that no child, no matter how mature, should have to carry. And yet he spoke calmly, as if he knew what he needed to say, as if he felt that keeping it would be denying the reason he came back. Christian continued counting slowly, with long pauses between one sentence and another. It was as if each memory came with a sacred weight. And then he looked at his mother, held her hand, and said, "Mommy." He was there. Rachel, with a trembling voice, asked, "Who, my son?" And he, without blinking, replied, "Jesus." It wasn't a loose phrase from the mouth of a child raised in faith. It was a statement, a testimony, a confession coming from the deepest part of someone who saw what human eyes cannot see. He described the scene as if he were still there. He said that, in that place of light where he was being taken, suddenly everything became silent, an absolute silence. But this silence did not cause fear, it caused reverence. He felt that something great was about to happen, and then, in the middle of the light, a presence appeared. He did not use the word appeared. He said the presence revealed itself, as if it had been there all along, but only at that moment had it allowed itself to be seen. Christian said that Jesus was surrounded by a light that did not come from outside, but from himself. It was as if he was made of light, but a living light, a breathing light. And even though it was so intense, that light didn't hurt the eyes. On the contrary, it made your heart beat slower, as if you found rest just by looking at it. He described Jesus in simple words, but they carried incredible depth for a 7-year-old child. He looked at me as if he had known me forever and loved everything about me, even what I wasn't even yet. Rachel heard that and couldn't hold back her tears. Thomas no longer cared about maintaining control. He cried openly, saying nothing, just listening. Christian continued. He said Jesus' look was one of love, yes, but there was more. There was urgency, a kind of silent sadness, as if he carries in his eyes the weight of all who turn away. He looked at me and said that many people are forgetting what true love is, and that hearts are hardening, Christian reported with a choked voice. He said that he did not hear Jesus speaking with his mouth, but inside him. It was as if the voice was everywhere at once, in the light, in the ground, in the air, in every part of his spiritual body. He said he understood everything without any words being spoken. I just knew. I knew what he wanted to tell me, and I felt everything very strongly. The description was so full of spiritual meaning that the parents just fell silent, absorbing every detail. But then, without anyone interrupting him, Christian closed his eyes and his breathing changed. The atmosphere in the room became heavy, as if the air had become denser. He whispered, but it wasn't all light. Rachel held her hand more firmly. He then explained that while he was standing before that presence that conveyed peace, love, and truth, he felt another presence coming, something totally different. It was as if the light was being surrounded by a shadow, a darkness that was not part of that environment. It was like a void, like there was something there just to turn off the light. Christian said he didn't see this presence forming like Jesus, but that, suddenly, it was there. He described it as a shaped shadow, no visible face but burning eyes. His eyes were red as coals, but it wasn't a good fire. It was a fire that burned with anger. He said he felt his spiritual body freeze, as if the heat that came from Jesus' presence was interrupted by that entity. The most surprising thing was the way Christian talked about it. He didn't scream, he didn't shake. It was as if he was in a state of alert, but without despair. He said that that shadow didn't speak with words, but that he understood what she wanted. He wanted me to go with him, but not by choice. He wanted me not to come back. This sentence echoed like silent thunder among the parents. Christian said that at that moment he looked at Jesus again, and that's when something happened. He described how Jesus, with a simple gesture, not violent but firm, prevented that shadow from getting any closer. He said there was authority in the gesture, an authority that did not need brute force because it was made of absolute truth. Christian said that when Jesus looked at him at that moment, his eyes changed. They were still loving, but there was firmness, a kind of pure justice. It was as if he said, "Not here. This is mine." Rachel sobbed. Thomas didn't know where to put his hands anymore, trying to contain his tears. What their son was telling was not only impactful, it was sacred. Christian then said that at that moment, he felt a very strong heat and suddenly everything started to move away. The light, the shadow, everything. He felt pulled back, but not like someone was being ripped away. It was more like it was being returned carefully, as if a mission had just been started. And he ended that story with a sentence that Rachel wrote in a prayer notebook that she carries to this day. Jesus looked at me and said that I needed to go back, that there was still something I needed to tell. He didn't explain what it was. I just said I knew there was more, much more, and that, for now, I couldn't say everything at once. There are things that you can only understand with time, Mum. Christian's words began to circulate. The pastor of the local church went to the hospital. Then, a leader of a Christian community from another state. They wanted to hear it with their own ears. They wanted to know if that child had really experienced something supernatural, and every person who entered that room left in silence, touched, transformed, because there was an anointing there, something that couldn't be explained, something you felt. The days passed, and Christian began to improve physically, but spiritually, he was no longer the same. His eyes continued to deepen. He prayed before meals with words he didn't usually use. Sometimes he made drawings with symbols that even he couldn't explain. He said that some came with him to remember. Rachel, despite being emotional, felt the weight of responsibility. She knew there was something bigger going on. He knew his son had been given more than a second chance. He had been chosen. In the days following that profound testimony, something very subtle and at the same time extraordinary began to happen. Christian not only recovered physically at a speed that doctors couldn't explain, he began to remember details, as if each night's sleep rearranged the pieces of a divine puzzle. Each morning was like the blossoming of a flower that had been born in another garden, on another plane. It was clear. He was carrying something, and more than that, it was carrying a message. Rachel felt in her spirit that this was no longer just a report of a near-death experience. Something bigger was revealing itself through his son. And it wasn't imagination. It wasn't a child's thing. It was as if his mouth had been used to convey what human eyes don't want to see. What Christian began to say in the following days could in no way have come from himself. He spoke with a wisdom that did not belong to him, with expressions he would never have heard before. One silent afternoon, while Rachel was setting up the table in her room, Christian said without being asked, "Mommy, Jesus told me something." She stopped what she was doing and slowly turned around. "What did he say, son?" Christian looked at the window, where the sun's rays danced between the leaves, and replied in a firm voice. He said, "Tell them, time is running out." Those words sounded like thunder in Rachel's chest. It was as if she had heard a trumpet. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't ask anything else at that moment, just walked over and hugged him, feeling that there was a truth there greater than any rational explanation could support. But it didn't stop there. Christian began to say sentences that seemed full of revelations. They weren't just memories, they were like prophetic warnings. He said that Jesus spoke sadly about how hearts were moving away from the truth, as if love was being exchanged for fleeting distractions, as if people were forgetting who they were and where they were going. He said there are people who believe they are going to the light, but they are going to the dark. Rachel felt chills when she heard that. She knew the Bible, grew up in the church, and knew what those words could mean. But there was more. Christian spoke in a way that didn't make sense for his age. He said, for example, "The world is full of noise, but heaven speaks in the silence." He said Jesus explained that people are listening to many voices, but few are listening to the voice that really matters. People's ears are too busy to hear what the sky is saying. He said this, looking fixedly at his father, as if he was delivering a direct message. There was a moment when Rachel calmly asked Christian to explain further what he meant by "time is running out." The answer came like an arrow. Jesus said that many people think they have time, but they don't. That there are people who are waiting to feel something to change, but the time for feeling has passed. Now is the time to choose. These words shook the whole family, but the most impressive thing is that he didn't speak with despair or weight. Christian said everything with a supernatural serenity, as if he knew he was being the spokesperson for something much bigger, and this was confirmed in the details. He once said he saw people walking in different directions, some towards the light, others towards shadows. Rachel asked if he knew them. Christian replied, "No, but Jesus said that everyone was choosing without even knowing it." One of the things that marked Rachel the most was one morning when she woke up to her son whispering. She thought he was having a nightmare, but as she got closer, she realized he was praying, alone in the dark, speaking in words she had never taught. He said, "Lord, wake up those who sleep because the enemy is deceiving those who think they are awake. It paralyzed her. It was a profound prayer from someone who knew the invisible spiritual wars. Thomas, the father, who always had a more intellectual faith, began to pray like he had never done before. He himself began looking for verses to try to understand what his son was saying. He wondered how a boy who could barely write complete sentences could speak of eternal choices, spiritual voices, and traps of false light. Christian used expressions that only Bible scholars or more experienced spiritual leaders knew. Jesus once said, "Tell them that even the chosen are being distracted by good things, but not holy." This broke Thomas inside. The boy didn't stop there. Sometimes he uttered phrases that seemed to be taken from ancient prophecies. There are people preparing for tomorrow, but not ready for later. Or else, people have forgotten the sound of eternity. They were words that came like keys, like codes, and they all seemed to say one thing: wake up before it's too late. Rachel started writing everything down in a notebook. He called it Notebook of the Words of Heaven. She wrote down each sentence Christian said with the date and time. And that notebook grew, gaining pages full of messages, some marked with tears, others with letters trembling with emotion. But each word carried the fingerprint of something eternal. Many of the people who started visiting Christian were impacted. Religious leaders listened and remained silent. Some were crying. Others asked to pray with him. An evangelical lady who participated in an intercession group said that she felt the Holy Spirit intensely when she heard him speak. Heaven is still speaking, but almost no one is listening. She said she spent 3 days without being able to sleep properly, praying, crying, regretting. But what was most impressive was that, even after everything, Christian didn't see himself as special. He didn't behave like someone who wanted attention. He was still a child. I played simple games, liked to draw, laughed at silly things, but there was a new sparkle in his eyes, a spiritual maturity that only those who went through something beyond the veil could carry. And every now and then, he would say a sentence in the middle of the ordinary day that took everything apart. Like when he said, "We need to talk to God before the world gets too noisy again." Rachel sometimes sat alone on the porch of the house, looking at the sky and trying to understand the size of it all. The responsibility, the privilege, the fear. She knew that everything Christian said couldn't just stay there behind 4 walls. I knew that what he experienced needed to be told, because his words were not just testimony, they were a warning from heaven. In that silent hospital room in Lexington, where hope met fear and prayers echoed louder than any diagnosis, something inexplicable happened. It was morning, the sun turned the sky golden, and Rachel, as always, was at her son's side, hands clasped with his, the Bible open to Psalm 121. Christian moved his lips. Rachel thought it was a spasm, but then he said, his voice weak and clear, "I saw Jesus, and he told me to come back." These words cut through the silence like an invisible sword. Rachel cried, overcome by something that went beyond joy. It was the certainty that something profound had happened. His eyes had changed. There was an unprecedented serenity and spiritual maturity in them. Doctors were called. Christian was stable, lucid, with no signs of trauma. In less than 24 hours, he was speaking complete sentences, clearly, calmly, and making unexpected observations. When asked if he knew he had slept for days, he replied, "I wasn't sleeping. I was somewhere else." Rachel and Thomas noticed subtle but profound changes, more patience, more kindness. He no longer complained about nonsense and said things like, "He has a noisy heart, Mum. He needs to listen to heaven more." He became interested in spiritual themes, especially the Gospels. Interestingly, I completed verses before Rachel even finished reading. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because I heard it there," he replied. Silence also became part of his routine. Christian, once talkative, now spent long moments just observing. He said he was listening from the inside, and that God speaks when we stop making noise. Sometimes he sat by the window and looked at the sky. One day he pointed to a cloud and said, "There are angels there, but we only see them when we close our eyes." He stopped liking cartoons, preferring soft music and praise. Nurses reported feeling peaceful upon entering the room. Some, even without active faith, felt the urge to pray inside. What impressed most were his simple but profound questions. Do you believe in eternity? Have you ever felt what it's like when the sky touches you? It wasn't provocation, it was purity. It was as if he was trying to understand if others were prepared for what he already knew. Rachel recorded everything. She knew something far beyond physical recovery was happening. Christian had returned, but he carried something, a calling, a consciousness that could not be explained by age or medicine. He also demonstrated a rare spiritual sensitivity. Once, during the dressing change, he looked at the nursing technician and said, "You have a sadness hidden inside." He pointed to his chest. The boy, shaken, left the room. Later, he returned with red eyes and asked to hold the boy's hand. They were silent for minutes. Afterwards, he thanked her and left. That's how the days were. Christian, with the sweetness of a child and the depth of someone who saw the invisible, touched people, not with noise, but with silence, gaze, presence. He said that the sky is calm and so is the truth, that the eyes of Jesus speak more than the mouths of many people, and that whoever has a heart full of things will have difficulty listening to what matters. The family was dazzled, confused, and touched at the same time. Nothing was the same as before. Not time, not days, not smiles. Christian had returned, but he had brought with him something that wasn't from here, something that was just beginning to be revealed. Since Christian came out of the coma and started sharing his experiences, the family's routine has completely changed. Not only was the worldview transformed, but also the perception of the invisible, the eternal, the spiritual. Rachel and Thomas began to live as if the veil between heaven and earth had been torn. What once seemed distant, biblical stories, preaching, was now real, close, alive. And what's more, it pulsed inside the house, in the words and in the eyes of his own son. Christian, once an ordinary and curious child, now had an inexplicable depth. He was still sweet and smiling, but his words had a weight, a wisdom that didn't come from books or age. He spoke less, listened more, and when he spoke, he touched the heart directly. Each sentence seemed charged with anointing, with spiritual authority. The family started to live differently. Meals became sacred moments of prayer. Rachel read Psalms with Christian every morning, and he always knew which one to choose, as if God was speaking for him. Thomas, previously more formal with his faith, now cried in prayers, read the Bible with devotion, and began to perceive the small signs of everyday life, breezes, repetitions of verses, children's words, as manifestations of the divine. Christian also changed his habits. He woke up early to talk to God while the world was still silent. He said that Jesus spoke more when his heart was empty of distractions. One day he said over coffee, "The silence of the morning is when the sky is still waking up the earth." Rachel wrote this sentence down in a notebook where she recorded everything her son said since he woke up from the coma, a diary that became a compendium of revelations. Soon, people started visiting the house. They were pastors, missionaries, curious people, unbelievers, all touched by something that was not Christian himself, but what flowed through him. One day, a lady who had lost her son and abandoned her faith was taken there. Christian held her hand and said, "Your son is fine. He felt it when you prayed that morning. Now you need to forgive yourself." The woman cried like she hadn't done in years, and right there she returned to God. These meetings became frequent. Christian didn't make promises or sessions. He just lived, and in that living, he touched lives. Rachel understood that this was more than a near-death experience. It was a calling, a ministry, without a pulpit, without a microphone, but filled with the presence of God. Many returned to praying, believing, seeking. Listening to Christian talk about eternity was not like listening to a dream, but a report from someone who had already been there. When asked if he was afraid of death, he said, "What I'm afraid of is that I won't be hearing the signs when Jesus speaks to me." A phrase that silenced even an experienced pastor. Christian also talked about life, distractions, daily choices, the excessive rush for empty things. "The eyes are more full of screens than of light," he once said. At another point, he said, "There are people who think they still have time, but time is already screaming. It's just not listening to those who have already gone deaf inside." Phrases like these were noted down by Thomas, who saw spiritual nourishment in them. Without seeking fame, Christian's story spread. Pastors from other states wrote one saying, "Your house has become an altar, and your son a trumpet of the Lord." Rachel cried when she read it, not out of vanity, but because I knew it was true, it was real, it was spiritual, it was urgent. Today, Christian continues to live simply, but your eyes, your perception, your heart, Everything has been transformed. And his family with him continues to learn to read the signs that previously went unnoticed. Because this story is not just theirs, it belongs to all of us. Getting this far shows that your heart recognized the signs. When the sky speaks, something inside us awakens. Write in the comments, living faith. This simple word can be the light that another heart needs to find. With an open heart, answer, are you ready for what comes after death? When something touches the soul, it is not by chance. It is God calling. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Here, each story is a step of faith, hope, and transformation. Something even deeper awaits you. Click on the next video appearing on the screen. The next story carries a revelation that could shake everything you believe. Go with your heart prepared. I'll meet you there.